thank you again, everyone, for joining today's Spain Digital Nomad Visa webinar. My name is Marian Vanslembrouck. I'm the founder of Lakbyte. And again, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today for what I believe is a truly essential update for the entire DNV community. So today we will be covering quite a lot. So stick with me. We might even go over 1 hour, but stick with me and we'll take care of all your questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So as we go through, feel free to drop all your questions on the chat box to the right, and we'll get through all of them at the end. And I would just like to request if you could leave it in English just so that everyone who's joining can understand. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So So today we will be first talking about the DNV by the numbers. So how many approvals, what percentage of approvals, and then we'll go with the application process and the requirements. And then we'll also discuss a very important update with proving your qualifications, whether it's via degree or experience. Then the financial requirements as well as special cases, bringing your family, and the final step of the approval. So let's start with the DNV by the numbers in 2025. So we started Lakbyte back in 2023, and since then we've had over 411 approvals. And in 2025 alone, we've had 169 approvals this year. Of all of these approvals, 63% applied from within Spain and 37% applied from consulates abroad. Now, most of our clients are from the US, the UK, Australia, Philippines, as well as from the UAE, but we also have clients from Azerbaijan, Belarus, Brazil, Canada, um, China, Colombia, etc. Now, a very common question is where and how can you apply for the Spain Digital Nomad Visa? So you essentially have two options. You can apply from abroad or in the country of the consulate where you're residing, and you will get a 1 year visa, and this is going to be issued via way of a visa sticker that's going to be attached to your passport. You can also apply from within Spain, but you have to enter Spain on a tourist visa or on a visa free entry passport, and you have to apply while you still have valid Schengen days. Now, one of the pro tips that we want to advise most of those who are planning to apply is that if you enter the Schengen area through another country which isn't Spain, normally you will be stamped at the passport control of that Schengen country. So you will not have proof that you've actually entered Spanish territory, so you will have to show an additional form called the entry declaration form. Now, you will also see that we've actually indicated applying from Spain as recommended simply because we've seen over the past year that consulates have started adding requirements which go above and beyond the law or take such a long time to issue decisions. So right now, our general recommendation really is if you can, do apply from Spain. Now, before we move further, there are three terms that I would like to clarify as that you also see a lot as you go on this journey. So first you have the NIE, the TIE, and the Padron. So the NIE is effectively your identification number. Your TIE is your actual plastic physical residence card, and your Padron is your proof of address in Spain. So first, let's start with the NIE. So the NIE, or the Número de Identificación de Extranjero, it's basically your foreigner identification number. And it's a unique number assigned to everyone or every foreigner in Spain once you're here on official business. So how you get the NIE will depend on where you apply. So if you apply from the consulate, you will actually have to obtain the NIE before you actually submit your DNV application. So you can't submit your DNV application unless you have this number. And in some consulates, it can actually take more than 3 months to get this. The other alternative is if you apply through Spain with a representative like Lakbyte, for example, your NIE will actually be issued together with your approval letter. So you don't have to apply for it beforehand, and you'll actually save a lot of time doing so. So you only have to wait for the approval letter, and it's going to appear there together with your approval. Now, if you're not applying through a representative, but you're planning to do it yourself, of course you have to get a NIE first because that's what you will need to obtain the certificate that will allow you to submit it online. Okay, so now that we have the NIE, what is about the TIE? So the NIE, to be clear, it's just a number. The TIE is the actual physical plastic card. So this process only happens once you're in Spain after your approval. So regardless if you have the 1-year DNV or the 3-year DNV, the TIE is always just going to be done in Spain because you have to first book a fingerprinting appointment at the police station, attend your appointment, have your fingerprints taken, and then you bring your approval letter or your visa, the forms, and your photos. And then 30 to 40 days after, you'll have to return to the same police station to pick up the card. Okay. Next is the Padron. So the Padron or the empadronamiento, it's effectively your official proof of address. It's a certificate from your local town hall or the ayuntamiento registering you as a resident of that municipality. So normally you'll need it for a lot of things, but usually at the start you'll normally need it for your TIA appointment. So if you are in Madrid or Barcelona or one of the islands, there are actually specialty appointments that you can attend which don't require the padron. But most of the smaller-ish provinces, smaller cities, some police officers will really require it, even if it's the initial issuance of your TIE. So how do you get the padron? It's again different per municipality or per city, but generally you will have to issue or present a rental contract of more than 6 months, proof of rent payment or utility bill, or if someone's already registered on the Padron, they can also authorize you to be added to the Padron. So some municipalities or provinces, you can get it within the same day, some in 2 weeks, some even 1 month, and some even do an inspection. So as you will see later on, you will see that things in Spain are very often answered with "it depends." Okay. So this isn't so clear, I believe, but effectively these are sample documents of how it looks like. So the first document is approval letter. And you will see that on the upper left-hand part, that's where the red box is. That's usually where your NIA will be shown. And in the second part, which is the NIA certificate itself, this is only if you just get the NIA, for example, if you're applying for the consulate. And the third item there is a sample padron, which you will get once you register at the municipality. And here we also have a sample TIA. So this is how the front of the residence card looks like. So it's really almost like a license as well. Okay, and again, the difference of applying in Spain and the consulate. So again, if you apply in Spain with a representative, you don't need a NIE. You also don't need to obtain medical insurance. So if you apply in Spain, most likely you're applying as a freelancer. So you'll have to register for Social Security, and this would also cover you for healthcare. However, if you're applying as an employee in Spain, you do have to have medical insurance, except if you have for example, for UK applicants, the S1 certificate, which would cover you for this. Next, you also don't need to have a medical exam if you are applying in Spain. For most consulates, this is required, and you have to show proof that you don't suffer for any medical conditions under the International Health Regulations of 2005, and usually these cover communicable diseases of a public nature. And lastly, you also don't need an income tax return to prove income. So we started seeing it from some consulates, notably the Philippines, where they've now started requiring income tax returns to prove income, even if you've already sufficiently proven this with bank statements and related financial documents. Right. So now that we know a general idea of the documents and of the terms, let's talk about timeline. So there are effectively two phases for the timeline. So the first phase is for your document preparations or actual document preparation. And the second phase is actual government processing timeline. So these are two phases and they have separate timelines, depends on where and how you're processing. So the fastest that we've ever had someone process an application was 1 week. This was an applicant back last year. When they got to us, they had no criminal check, they had no degree, they had no experience documents, nothing. But their Schengen days were expiring already, and so they engaged us with only a week left until their Schengen days expired. They had also no translations. But I would say that that is a rare, very rare exception. For most clients, it takes 1 to 2 months. It's a realistic time frame for a lot. On average, if you don't want to be rushing, it's going to be 2 to 3 months. And most of our clients are engaged as 3 to 6 months in advance. So, what are key delays that you have to factor in? So, if you come from a country where you need a Schengen visa to enter Spain, you will actually have to factor in the time that it takes to get your Schengen visa. Secondly, if you plan to apply from a Spanish consulate, you will also have to factor in the time to get the NIE. So, this can sometimes take up to 3 months. Thirdly is degree documents, especially if you graduated from a country which isn't a country that you're currently residing in. Trying to get that degree can also sometimes cause a delay. For US applicants, the most common source of delay is actually the FBI check. So the check itself can come back very quickly. So it can even come back as you're driving home from the post office. However, the apostille can take over 14 plus weeks unless you use an agent to expedite it. For UK applicants, on the other hand, the most common source of delay is the A1 certificate, which is currently taking over 16 plus weeks. Excuse me. Okay, now what about the government processing timeline? How long does it take for the Spanish government to actually process your application? So, if you're applying from a consulate abroad, legally, they have 10 working days to decide on your application. Practically, that's not exactly what happens. So there are some consulates that actually try their best to stick to the timeline, and they're known for actually issuing a decision in the timeline that is presented. For example, the ones in Japan and in Thailand. For others, it's often much longer. So there are consulates that can take 30 plus working days to issue it, and even 4 months, like the Philippines, and up to even 10 months, for example, for the ones in Bangladesh and Egypt. And again, for these kinds of applications, there's no guarantee as there's a no administrative silence policy in the consulate. Now, on the flip side, if you are applying from Spain via the UHE, they have legally 20 working days to act on your application, and this deadline is generally respected. If they don't respond to your application in 20 working days, then your application will be deemed automatically approved via administrative silence. Last year in 2024, the only time I had to do this was sometime in January. However, this year we've had to do it twice. Once was in May, which I believe was a result of influx of a number of applications trying to catch up with the golden visa deadline in April. So we've had a few applicants who were approved by administrative silence that we had to file administrative silence requests for in May. And then just also in June, we've had applicants who applied in the third week in June who apparently looked like they were skipped. So we had to file administrative silence requests for them, which was strange since those who applied a week after them got approved in 13 to 15 working days. So it's things like this that can also sometimes be very random. Okay, so now we have some general timeline, frequently asked questions, and tips. So, how far in advance can you apply? If you are applying via the consulate, you can apply up to 6 months before your planned departure date. However, if you're applying in Spain, you actually have to apply while you're validly here on Spain, whether that's valid Schengen days or on your 90-day Schengen allowance. Next question is, what if my tourist visa expires or I run out of Schengen days while I wait? So, as long as your application is submitted in Spain, you can legally remain in the country while you wait for the decision, even after your visa or your 90-day allowance expires. So, what if I don't hear back after 20 working days in Spain? Again, so congratulations, that would already be considered approved by administrative silence. All you need to do is wait for your approval letter. Okay. So let's also talk about a little bit of a timeline and strategy for the 1 year visa as well as the 3 year residence authorization. So the 1 year visa, you can actually convert it to a 3 year residence authorization, but it's not a conversion since it's actually considered an initial application in and of itself. So most people, what they do is they get the 1 year and effectively they treat it as a Schengen visa. They fly over to Spain, and then once they arrive in Spain, that's what they actually use to apply immediately for the 3 year residence authorization. Now, this is a very common route of doing it simply because, one, the documents are still actually valid. So they make sure that the documents haven't expired so that they can reuse the same documents. And at this point, most of these documents are already scanned and translated. And do note that in the UHE, or when you apply in Spain, the application is done entirely online. So all that you will have to do is submit scanned copies of your documents. However, you do have to show that you physically arrived here for main applicants. Another reason why a lot of people prefer to do it this way is that it effectively locks in the requirements as of that date. So if you've been following the DNV for a while, you will note that it's very notorious for changing requirements once every few months. Another reason that people choose to immediately do it is so that if there are any salary increases, then you don't have to, at least they won't have to prove it by that time. Okay. Another common misconception is that once I have a 1 year visa and apply for the 3 year residence authorization, I will automatically be approved for the 3 years. So this isn't true. The 3 year residence authorization, as I mentioned, is a new application. You really have to also prove that you meet the requirements in Spain, whether that's document wise and income wise. So we have a lot of applicants who initially DIY their 1 year application for the visa, and then they then seek our help to apply for the 3 year residence authorization in Spain. And normally the parts that we see need improvement are usually the authentication of the government documents and making sure that they're authenticated properly. The consulate isn't as strict with this, but especially when it comes to corporation certificates, for example, certificates of good standing, the UE is a little bit more strict. So this is the portion that we see a lot of those who are transitioning from a 1 year DNV to a 3 year DNV, things that they would have to improve or things that we have to fix at that time. Another thing that we also see a lot is that most 1 year DNV applicants will show a lower amount of income. But when you apply in the UHE, you really have to meet the UHE income, even if you're already approved for the 1 year digital nomad visa. Okay, so now that we know all of that, let's talk about the in Spain digital nomad visa application process. So while you're in country, while you're in your home country, you'll already get your contracts, your degree, your criminal check redone. Or if it's your initial application and you're just planning to fly to Spain, you'll initially get all of that done. As all the documents are valid 6 months from their date of issue. And note that it's from their date of issue and not from the date of apostle. Because it can be that, for example, your criminal check is issued today, however, you still get it apostilled 1 month later. But that 6 month count will start from the actual date of issue and not the actual date of apostle. So now that you have that, you then will fly, arrive, and prove your entry into Spain. So if you fly directly into a Spanish airport, no issues, it will show a Spanish stamp. If you fly towards another Schengen airport, that's also fine, not an issue. You just have to get the entry form as soon as you've entered Spain. And then once you're here, you submit the application. And if, for example, you've engaged us at that point in time when you're flying into Spain, the only thing missing from your application, as everything will have already been translated, apostilled, and the only thing missing will be the entry stamp. Once we have that entry stamp, as long as we receive it before 3 p.m. of the same day, we're able to submit at the same day. If not, it's going to be submitted the next morning. Another common question we get is how long do we have to stay for submission? So technically just 1 day is needed. However, we do require our clients to stay for at least 3 days to ensure a smooth process. So the reason for this is that the UHE website sometimes goes down. So even if we only need you to be here in Spain at the time that we submit your application, it can happen that the website goes down, so that's why we ask for 3 days, at least to give us leeway until the website is up. Okay. Another question regarding to staying or leaving is, should I stay in Spain once I've submitted my application? So this one, it will really depend on whether or not, what kind of visa that you actually have, right? So if you have a single entry visa, then you will normally it would be very advisable that you stay in Spain until you're approved. This means because if you leave Spain, you cannot re-enter until on the same visa, so it's only single entry. If you want to come back here, then you'll have to get a separate Schengen visa to come back. So you can travel within the Schengen area, but you must return to Spain before the visa expires. Next is if you have a multiple entry Schengen visa, this gives you the maximum flexibility. So you can enter Spain to apply, like in 3 to 5 days, for example, then leave and then go back to your country and wait for the decision. However, it also sometimes will depend on the validity of your multiple entry Schengen visa because it can be multiple entry, but it's only valid for like August 1 to August 15. Then very likely the decision is not yet going to be issued by then, and you won't be able to use the same visa to fly back. And lastly, for visa-free entry, so for example, nationals from US, UK, Australia, etc., it will function similarly to a multiple entry visa. So you enter, you apply, and then you leave. A lot of my US applicants also prefer to just fly over on the initial start of their 90 days and then stay here until they're approved. Okay. Now, what about let's talk about how fast we're able to actually handle an application. So we generally these figures here are our fastest cases. Okay, so this isn't standard, and we would like to request if we do engage us to please try and engage us at least 2 to 3 months before, just so that it's a smooth sailing journey. But these are examples of how fast we've had to turn around a few applications. So for example, you'll see here there's an individual where we were engaged August 7, and just 1 week after, August 14, we had already submitted their application. This is the case that I was talking about earlier. So we only had 6 days to prep everything, all the person's apostilles, translations, review of his documentation. But they were approved with no request for additional documents in 15 days. So total time from the time that we were engaged to the time that they got their approval was 4 weeks. We also had in the same period of time a family of four. We were engaged August 20. But their documents, this family was initially coming over on a 1 year DNV. So they already had documents, but those documents were expiring by September 1, and we only received the complete package by August 28th. And this family, I think they had four clients that they used to qualify. So we had to stitch together all the invoices, financial tracing documents over separate bank accounts, over separate invoices, all within 3 days. And then, okay, so we had to submit it before the documents expired. And then they were approved just 14 working days later. A very, very recent fast turnaround as well is a couple. We were engaged on June 16th, just last year, June 16, and we submitted their application on June 30, so just in 11 working days. And they were approved in 14 working days on July 18. So that one took 4.5 weeks. So this is the fastest it can be. Normally, this really is already the fastest. So 1 month or 4 weeks from the time that we're engaged to approval. If you expect it faster than that, we cannot work miracles. Unfortunately, we really try our best, but this is already the fastest it can go. Okay, so now you're approved. Now it's actually taking around 15 to 17 working days. We've also had some applicants take up to 19 days. Lately, they've slowed down again. So during the first part of May and June, they were really taking the full 20 working days, and then they sped up until like 13 working days in early July, and now they've slowed down again. So again, if you're applying in Spain, you can get a request for approval by administrative silence if they don't act on your application within 20 working days. And once you get your approval, you will then go for your fingerprinting appointment for your TIE. And depending on what you have, the visa you have, that will also influence what your post-approval travel strategy is. So if, for example, your visa or your 90-day allowance expires before you get your TIE, you have the first option is to just wait in Spain and wait for your TIE. The option two is if, for example, you need to travel, like there's a family emergency, there's a wedding, there's a conference that you have to attend. The other thing that you can do is you can get a return permit or what's called the autorización de regreso. And that document can only be obtained after you've attended your initial fingerprinting appointment. It will then act similarly to a Schengen visa, and it will allow you to leave and re enter Spain within 90 days from this issuance. But just remember that although this document will act as a multiple entry document as within that 90-day period, you must fly back directly to a Spanish airport or enter through a Spanish port on a regress. So you can't use it to enter other Schengen areas. Okay. So now that you have approved for your DNV, what about what happens after renewals, residency, and citizenship? So this is the general timeline. Of course, this can, like your personal situations, can vary, but this is a general timeline of how it should go if everything goes well. So years 1 to 3 will be your initial 3-year residence authorization. At the end of year 3, you will then be able to apply for a 2-year renewal. Beyond years 4 to 5, if you don't get permanent residency, you will then be able to renew it for 2 years at a time. But if, for example, years 4 to 5, after 5 years, you can also do the path to long-term residency opens up. Okay. So the renewal process after year 3 or after year 2, if you're here as an employee with an A1 certificate, you can apply for this around 60 days before it expires. And this will again be an additional 2 years from the 3 years. Effectively, it's very similar to a first application, except that you can reuse some documents, of course. Okay, another myth that I want to dismantle is this 183-day myth. So, a lot of people think that as long as I spend 183 days in Spain, I can qualify for everything: citizenship, long term residency, etc. So, this is unfortunately not true. Hopefully, it was, but it's not the case. So, the 183-day rule is important as it allows you to keep your residency. So, it's just so that you qualify and that you keep and maintain your residency and that it isn't canceled. What it is not for is it doesn't mean that if you spend 183 days a year, you can then qualify for citizenship or you can qualify for long term residency. So, for long term residency, please note that the rule is different. So, across the 5 years, you have to make sure that you don't spend more than 10 months in total outside of Spain, and it must not be for 6 consecutive months at any one time. Okay. Now, what about the path to Spanish citizenship, which I think a lot of our viewers will also be very excited to learn about? So, for the accelerated path for 2 years, this applies for those who are citizens of the Philippines, American countries, especially. And the challenge here is that the law doesn't actually state a fixed number of days that you must be present. So you will see that there's going to be differing answers from differing lawyers, differing specialists, and simply because there's not a fixed rule. That's the only reason for that. So our conservative recommendation is that if you, since 2 years is actually quite short, it's a very very fast period. Without knowing it, we've had, like, I can't believe it, but we have a lot of people who are already going to be 2 years this year, our first applicants for the DNV, and a lot of them are going to start preparing for their citizenship application. However, our conservative recommendation, as mentioned earlier, is that you should try and not to be outside of Spain for more than 90 days cumulative over the entire 2 year period. I know some people were able to get away with 2 months in a year, for example. However, I would stick in try to keep it conservative. And then for all other nationalities, US, UK, Canada, you will actually have to show 10 years of continuous legal residence to apply for citizenship. So now that we know all of that, where are DNV holders moving to? So this is across all nationalities, so US applicants, UK applicants, Philippine applicants, etc. So most of them are, at least from our clients, are moving to Valencia. There's 28% of all of you in Valencia, 27% in Madrid, 11% in Barcelona, and 6% in Alicante. There are also quite a few in the Balearic Islands, in Granada, Murcia, and Malaga, and very, very small percentages in other parts of Spain. So if you can see from this result, a lot of the applicants are moving to the south of Spain. Okay, so now that we know all of that, let's start getting into the meatier part of today's discussion regarding documents. But before we can even start with documents, we have to first discuss how to actually legalize them. I still get a lot of questions like, what is an apostille? How do I legalize a document? So an apostille is basically a piece of paper, or depends how the country does it. But there's a standard format according to all countries in the Apostille Convention, and it's a single document that validates that the document has been validly issued by that country, and also validates the signature of the authorized signatory. However, if you come from a country where there's no that isn't a party to the Apostille Convention, for example, countries like the UAE, Thailand, for example, you have to bring the document first to your country's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then you'll have to get it legalized by the Spanish embassy or consulate in your country, or in the Spanish embassy or consulate that has jurisdiction over your place of residence, right? Okay, so now here we have the documents required for your application. So you will see that to make it very easy to visualize, there's an apostille and sworn translation column. So not all your documents will need to be apostilled, and not all your documents will have to be sworn translated. So let's talk about the first three documents. So these first three documents are the documents that you will have to be obtained from your client or from your employer. So it's either a current freelance or employment contract. You don't need to apostille this, but you do need to translate this. And then the letter from the client authorizing remote work from Spain, also not needed to be apostilled, but has to be sworn translated. And the certificate of incorporation or good standing from the client or your employer. So this is where I see a lot of applicants do it wrong, since they usually have the document notarized first and then apostilled. If that is the typical procedure in the country, so normally this applies to documents from states like Utah, for example, or from China, where the typical procedure is to have it notarized and then apostilled, and we can show proof that that is the typical procedure, then that's fine. But if the country actually has a procedure for direct apostilling of officially issued government documents, then we'll actually have to get it apostilled that way. So this is actually a service that we also offer directly. So if you need help, or if your clients or employers are based in the US, Australia, Canada, UK, Singapore, this is something that we directly help with. For all other countries, for example, the UAE, for example, lots of EU countries, Germany, Netherlands, we do have service providers that we've already worked with, so you can always feel free to reach out if you need help with this. Next is the criminal check. If you're from the US, it's the FBI check. If it's from the Philippines, the NBI, active certificate if you're from the UK. And of course, if you're from another country, it will of course depend on what the criminal certificate equivalent is from your country. Next is marriage or birth certificates. This only applies if you're bringing family. If you're only bringing yourself, no need for a birth certificate, because these are just to show the relationship of your family members to yourself. Next is educational credentials. These also have to be apostilled and translated. And this was actually relatively new. Like it's always been a requirement, but they became stricter with this requirement in December of last year. So it now really has to be apostilled before you submit it with your application. This other document, official government documents for proof of work, we will discuss this more in the next few slides, as it's very important. It's a very important change to the new guidelines, but this also initially changed in December of 2024. Next, you have your previous certificates of experience or certificates of employment. No need to apostille that, but you do need to sworn translate it. Financial documents, whether that's your invoices, pay slips, bank statements, no need to translate, no need to apostille. CV, you don't need to apostille, but you do need to simple translate it. No, it doesn't have to be a sworn translation. And insurance, again, if you're applying in Spain, only if you're applying as an employee. If you're applying in the consulates, you will sometimes have to provide it, even if you're applying as a contractor. Okay, now we'll take a little bit of time here, as this is an important new rule that I see a lot of people still get confused about. So you must prove that you are qualified or that you have experience related to your remote role. To prove this, there are two paths. So you must actually show that you have a degree that's related to your position. It may be a graduate or a postgraduate degree, or you must show that you have professional experience of 3 years in a role that's related to your current position. So if you are accrediting via a university degree, it will have to be something that's related to what you're currently doing as, and it must be apostilled. One of the most common issues that we've faced before, at least, is for those who have degrees which actually are considered regulated professions in Spain. So, for example, these are psychologists, lawyers, architects, civil engineers. We've had success in getting quite a few of these approved with presentation. In December last year, there was a conference where they clearly indicated first that if it was a regulated profession, then you would really have to homologate your degree, which essentially is trying to get it recognized here in Spain. And that process can take 1 to 2 years at least. However, in February of this year, we submitted an application, and surprisingly, one of the additional document requests that came back allowed us to show just a signed statement confirming that you will not practice a regulated profession in Spain. At that time, we were accrediting it via some other ways. It wasn't an issue, but it's great to see that the UHE has now specifically confirmed that if it's a regulated profession, as long as you have a signed statement confirming that you will not practice a regulated profession in Spain, then it should be fine. There are some document requests which will come back and say that the signed statement is enough, so that's enough. There are also some document requests which will ask you for it to be notarized. So depending on what documents you will get, that's what you will have to submit. So this whole presentation, we're really sharing like the results of additional document requests that we've had, over 400 plus successful applications, plus the new rules that were issued by the UHE, just so that you can see what the law actually states, what the rule states, and what actual practice really is and what's being accepted. Okay, so now let's talk about professional experience. So if this is the part where we've received the most significant changes to the rules, and it is the part that I see a lot of misadvice on, especially from consultants who don't specialize in the DNV or are very new to the DNV, or even if they're immigration lawyers or immigration specialists, but they don't specialize in the DNV or don't do it day to day, they get this one wrong. So for proof of 3 years of experience, let me be very clear that it has to be always two documents. You always have to have two documents. So one is, first you have to show the certificate of employment from a certain employer, and two is you must show an official government document matching that period of employment or that period of contractorship. So this must all add up to at least 36 months or 3 years, and it must be in roles related to what you're currently doing. Okay, so what are these official government documents? Normally, it's tax documents, social security documents, or documents showing your employment life history. So, if, for example, in the Philippines, this is the SSS certificate that you can get from the SSS. This can also be tax returns, like the annual tax return or Form 1701A, or if you're using the time that you were as an employee as experience, this is going to be your 2316. If you're from the US, it's going to be tax returns showing self-employment. So, for example, the Schedule C on their Form 1040. Also, you can also use 1099 or W-2 forms. If you're from the UK, it's very easy if you have your work life history, as it all is already stated there. Now, what if you say that I have none of these documents? I don't have government documents, especially as we have a lot of applicants from countries that aren't known for paying taxes. So, alternatives that have worked previously is one, proof of back payment of taxes for the last 3 years. And this second one, which is something that we discovered just in May as a possibility, is a proof of consistent payment transfers for 3 plus years, supported by highly detailed COEs. So for this client, we actually went back 36 months in the past. Actually, we even went above and beyond. We traced all their invoices, payment transfers from previous clients, plus matched it up with certificates of employment and how it related to their current position. And we ended up with a 200 plus page document. And I think it was a 30-page cover letter, just trying to explain everything and how this applicant actually qualified for the 3 years experience. So they were able to successfully get approved after we submitted that. Okay, so now what about the letter authorizing remote work? The EU has also now explicitly stated what they want to see on here. But this one, if you've been a client or if you've been following us for a while, you'll know that this is actually something that we've always recommended people do. So you have to always indicate the position and a detailed job description, your tenure, how long you've been with them, and make sure that it must be at least 3 months. The salary or the pay, and then we usually put it in the original currency and then the converted currency in euros. And very important, the explicit authorization allowing you to work remotely from Spain. Okay, now everyone's favorite question, income requirement. Let's discuss first the actual income requirement first. So if you are a family of one, if you are only applying as a main applicant, it's 2,763. If you have one dependent, it's 3,799. If you have 2 dependents and you're 3 in total, it's 4,144. If you are 4 in total, it's 4,490. If it's 5, it's 4,835. And if you're 6, it's 5,180. Now, please note that this income requirement is for 2025. If, for example, you're watching this in the future, it might have already changed by then. So all these figures here to the right are in gross. So this is before tax. And make sure, and please note that you cannot combine your income with a spouse to meet the income threshold. Okay. And as I mentioned, this is a fluctuating target. It usually changes, well, I won't say it usually, but historically it's changed yearly. And normally they discuss this in parliament towards the end of the year. And if, for example, they don't reach an agreement between the different groups, it carries over to January. That's why usually the official income requirement is then published in February. So what if you don't meet the income? So you have 4 alternatives before we discuss one of the recently confirmed alternatives. You can ask for a raise. You can add a new client. So if you have 4 or 5 clients, and we've had applicants who've applied with these types of applications, that is absolutely not an issue. It can absolutely be done. You can also negotiate a bonus, a quarterly bonus, because if you apply from the UHE, you can average the 3 months before you submit the application. And if the average meets the income requirement, then you should be good to go. You can also work and bill for overtime. So these are the alternatives that our clients have tried and tried to do just so that they can meet the income requirement. So here's a graph that we made to show how the income has increased from 2008 to 2024. So you will see here that it actually, let me just change the slide. Okay, you will see that it will actually show the, generally, it's a 3 to 5% increase. The biggest increase happened in 2023. That's around an 8% increase. But generally, it's a 3 to 5% increase yearly. Okay, now we have the income requirement. How do you actually prove that? So your paper trail or your financials must create a clear financial story. So for these documents, you must present an invoice or a payslip, depends if you're an employer or a contractor, for the last 3 months prior to the month that you're applying, plus a bank statement for the last 3 months. So it cannot just be the transaction or the payment transaction in your bank account. It must be your actual statements. And you have to also prove or clearly trace that it's the employer or the client that has actually paid this payment. So normally how we do this is we do prepare a financial tracing cover letter to connect the dots for all of our clients so that it's clear that for this invoice, this is the payment, this is the average in euros for the past 3 months for this applicant. So normal platforms or very common platforms that we see most of our applicants get paid through or work through is Upwork. Very, very common. We also see a lot of applicants being paid via Wise. It's actually my favorite if a client is paid through this, simply because if you have a Wise statement, it's easy. It's relatively easy to download this directly in Spanish, and we can use those statements to apply. PayPal as well. We also see a lot of Payoneer, Veeam, Gusto, and Deal and Remote.com, especially for Deal. So we also see, although Deal and Remote.com are employers of record, we also see a lot of contractors hired through these platforms. Okay, now this one I get so much questions with regard to using savings to supplement income. The first time we did this was in February 2024 last year, and we among us consultants, it's been recognized that it is possible. However, it's always been a case to case basis, simply because it wasn't an explicit rule espoused by the UHE. We would only see it in additional document requests, and before, the additional document request would actually allow you to provide 24 to 36 months. But it seems like with the new regulations, it looks like they're really asking you to cover the difference in 36 months. So how it works is, for example, if you miss the income requirement by, let's say, 100 euros, all you have to do is multiply 100 euros by 36 months, which is equivalent to the 3 years for your 3-year residence authorization. Then you just have to show separate savings in the amount of 3,600. And make sure, this is also where a lot of people get it wrong, it has to be an account separate from the account that you receive your payroll in. Okay, it must be stamped and signed for the bank, and it's a bank certificate, not the bank statement. Okay, So let's talk about another common issue for confusion for a lot of aspiring applicants if you can apply as an employee and or as a contractor. So I will say that generally, most of the people apply as contractors. You can still apply as an employee, but only under very specific conditions. So how can you apply as an employee? So there are only two pathways. So first is, and I will say, and I will preface this by saying that most employers are very, very unlikely to adopt or embrace this method because it involves them opening a representative office with no physical presence in Spain and registering and paying your social security contributions in Spain, which, as you can imagine, most companies are very unwilling to do if you're a regular employee and they're only going to be doing for one person. It exposes them to legal and financial liability, which of course most companies are adverse to, and of course additional work. Pathway two, which is the very common pathway, is to use a social security agreement if Spain has a social security agreement with your country. Now, Spain has social security agreements with many countries. However, that social security agreement must also cover remote workers. So even if you come from a country that Spain has a treaty with, if it doesn't cover remote workers or telework, then you won't be able to use or you won't be able to apply as an employee. So usually this is confirmed with a certificate of coverage. If, for example, for the UK, it's the A1 certificate issued by your home country social security institution. Okay, so which countries currently qualify under this? So initially it was just UK, Russia, and most of the EU countries. Eventually, Colombia and Chile were added, and just this 2025, we now officially covers workers from the US and Canada. So this is really welcome news, especially for US applicants, as I used to get on so many calls with those who were W2 employees but couldn't apply for the DNV unless they shifted over and became 1099 contractors just to apply for the visa. So now, even if you're a W2 employee in the US, you can already apply for the Spain Digital Nomad Visa. And this has already been actually explicitly confirmed by the UHAM themselves. Okay, now let's talk about whether you are considered an employee or a contractor, as I also see a lot of people get confused by this. You are definitely an employee if your company withholds your taxes, your social security, and provides leave benefits, other sorts of benefits on your behalf. So normally, if you're based in the same country as your employer, if you're employed and they withhold all these benefits and taxes on your behalf, it's likely that you're an employee, and then you'd have to show that your company is either willing to register and pay your social security in Spain, or whether you come from a country with a valid social security agreement covering remote workers. If you are paid by an EOR, sometimes you can be considered an employee, as it's also a valid way for foreign companies to hire foreign applicants in their respective countries. But it isn't automatic that if you're hired by an EOR that you're an employee. There are also platforms, especially Deal or Remote.com, as I mentioned earlier, that a lot of contractors are also hired through these entities. So it's not a given. Now, there's also this 3-month rule that a lot of people sometimes overlook. So, if, for example, you are coming from a country where there's no social security agreement and you've been an employee at the same company for over 10 years, but you want to apply for the Spain Digital Nomad Visa, for purposes of experience, you can use the 10 years to prove that you have 3 years of experience. However, for purposes of the application, you must become a contractor 3 months before you apply. So, regardless of the fact that you've been with the same company for 10 years as an employee, you still have to become a contractor at least 3 months before you submit your application. I hope that's clear. Okay, so tax implications. This is just a very, very introductory discussion, as we will discuss a little bit more on taxes and social security at the end of the webinar. So for employees, so whether that's registration by the company here in Spain on your behalf or doing it via a social security treaty, you will be eligible for Beckham's Law. And this offers you the option of a 24% flat tax rate on your Spanish sourced income. So for contractors, on the other hand, you are not eligible for Beckham's Law. So this is a common source of confusion because a lot of blogs or a lot of influencers, even at the start when this visa was announced, they were really touting the flat tax rate of 24%. But this isn't true. If you're applying for a freelancer, you will not be eligible for this. You will instead pay taxes on a graduated scale, which can go up to 47%, depending on your income. And note that just because you can't apply for the Beckham's Law, it's not always better, since if you have a lower income, the graduated tax rates might actually result in less tax versus the flat 24%. Okay. Now let's talk about special cases. I see also a lot of people get confused by this. So let's talk about sole proprietors and company owners. So it's before it was initially thought that if you're a sole proprietor, if your client is a sole proprietor, or if yourself is a sole proprietor, then you can't apply for the digital nomad visa. So to be clear, you can still apply even if you're sole proprietor, as long as you have proof of registration, and that proof of registration can be properly apostilled in the country of origin, showing that you've been registered for at least a year. The first one we were able to do this for was actually a psychologist registered in California back in January of 2024. So as far back as then, it's been possible, and it's only been made clearer now. So you have two scenarios here. You can have your own company, as in Marian Vanslembrouck LLC, as your client, or you can also apply of it as Marian Vanslembrouck LLC as a company owner itself. It's just that if, for example, they see that this is a company owned by you, or if you directly accredit yourself as a company owner applying through your own company, this will trigger an immediate request for additional requirements if you didn't present it at the start. So these kinds of applications are applications I would not recommend doing without a consultant, whether it's us or someone else, as these are notoriously difficult or challenging applications. So you would have to normally show proof of ownership or effective control, the company's latest tax return, proof of investments in productive assets, proof of employees, and quite a few things. But we've noticed that these four are the most commonly asked for. Okay. Next is other special cases. You have NGOs or foundations. It's possible. You just have to make sure that it's presented in a way to show that it's operating similar to a company. Next, we also have students in the DNV. So we've successfully helped over 12 language assistants as well as master students, or those here on a student visa, switch over to the DNV. The only slight complication happened in February. There were two applicants that we submitted applications for transitioning from the student visa to the DNV. They were initially denied on the basis that they didn't have a right to work in Spain. However, we then resubmitted the same applications in April with a detailed write-up explaining that this isn't required by the law, etc. We prepared a whole document for it, and luckily they were approved by then. And it appears that the UHE has changed their stance on this, as we've now submitted applications on and after May 20 from students who are transitioning from a student visa to the DNV, and they've all been approved. So the NLV to the DNV, it's also a possible pathway. Still, again, in the same period, it seemed like they were again saying that you couldn't transition, but it seems like it's possible again. And lastly, crypto professional. So not a lot of people know this, but my background is actually in fintech and blockchain law. So I have a fintech and blockchain background. So we've also been able to get those who have been paid in crypto. Over six of them already approved. It's really just a matter of presenting or arranging your application. And again, any of these cases, we don't recommend doing it yourself. And we would really strongly recommend going with a consultant. Okay, now let's talk about bringing your family. So we're at the last portion of our presentation. After this, the only last discussion we'll have will be on taxes and social security, and then we can then go to the Q&A. So who can you bring on the digital nomad visa? So you can bring your spouse or your unmarried partner, so your boyfriend or your girlfriend, you can bring them over. You can bring your children, whether they're minor or they're adults. And you can also bring your dependent parents. Now, for children, this can be children, your own children, or children of your spouse or your unmarried partner. And for parents, this can be your parent or the parent of your spouse or your unmarried partner. Okay, so for this slide, we're going right to left. So for a spouse, it's generally straightforward. You only have to prove that you have a marriage certificate. That's it, super simple. However, we've also found out, this is also an alternative that we found out, that online marriages, for example, in states like Utah, for example, those are also recognized as valid as long as you're able to have a state issued apostille certificate. These have all been approved with no further issues. Now let's talk about unmarried partners. I think we were one of the first firms that really specialized or focused on those who are applying as unmarried partners. And as of today, we've had 16 out of 16 unmarried couples approved. Nine of those have been straight couples, and then we've had seven of those as same-sex couples. So either option is fine. You just have to prove quite a few things. Again, these applications aren't straightforward, and usually the compilations reach 100 to 200 pages. So if you have a common child, it's generally more simple. So that one, you'll show the birth certificate of the child, and then you'll just have to show proof of cohabitation. Best practice, which we always try and include, is a notarial declaration regarding the circumstances of your relationship, as well as how long you've been living together. Another way, the easiest way, is to show your registration in a de facto partnership registry. So this is easy in some states, in some provinces in Canada, some provinces in Australia. We've also assisted clients with registering as pareja de hechos here in Spain in several different provinces, notably in Valencia, Barcelona, Murcia, and even Granada. And those are generally straightforward. And then we use that registration to add them as unmarried partners. How about if you come from a country where there's no registry? So, for example, Philippines, the US, for some states. So you have to show proof of 1 year of cohabitation with at least of two of the following. So it's either joint property or rental contract, shared residence registration or padronamiento if you're in Spain, joint ownership of a business or investments, and a joint bank account. So any of these two plus proof of 1 year of cohabitation would be fine. So before, we even had to present pictures, flights together. That isn't needed anymore. It's sometimes asked, like a relationship timeline is still sometimes asked in some consulates, but definitely not anymore in the UHE. Okay, now let's talk about children. So for children, you can actually bring minor children with no issues. So if it's a child, just bring their apostille birth certificate. If it's an adopted child, their apostille adoption certificate. And if only one parent is moving with a child, you'll have to show that there's a notarized and apostille affidavit of consent from the non-joining parent. Now, what about if the children is already an adult? So it depends if they're 18 to 25 years old or if they're 26 years old and above. So if they're 18 to 25 years old, you just have to prove that they're economically dependent, not independent, and that they don't receive any income or state benefits, usually proved by tax or social security certificates. You also have to prove that they're single and that they have not constituted a family of their own. So this is usually through a SENOMAR or a certificate of no marriage, certificate of singleness, depends on the country that's issuing the document. And we've also seen an increase in requests for proof that they're actually studying. If you are an adult child, so 26 plus, we've actually already successfully guided three adult dependent children through this. You normally will have to prove a medical incapacity that prevents you from being independent or free from your parents' dependency. So usually it requires medical reports, and I've noticed that the UHE prefers those kinds of reports that were issued before the application process began and ones that are not obviously just obtained for purposes of the application. Okay, next let's talk about parents. So we've also now had 7 out of 7 sets of parents approved, and this applies to the parents of either the main applicant or their spouse or unmarried partners. So if they're over 80, they're presumed dependent. Otherwise, you'd have to show at least 1 year financial support and that they have no significant income or pension. Or you can also provide proof, like for example, medical or social service report showing that they need care. Okay. Now, we're at the tail end of the family application. So, can one of the common questions that we get is, can your family apply even after the initial application? Like, do you all have to apply at the same time or not? So no, it's fine if they apply even after you're approved, several months after. It's not an issue as long as it's anytime while you have a valid residence authorization. It's just that when you add them to your application, you must provide proof that in the 3 months before you submit the application, you have updated financial documents covering the income requirement for how many you are. And you also have to show proof that you're already registered as autonomo if you're adding them later. Okay, and this is something that we are very proud of. This is something that we actually found out ourselves. We found out that dependents can apply from abroad. So the old assumption was that all of you actually would have to fly to Spain and actually apply here so that your application can be approved. What we found out though is that it's possible for just the main applicant to fly, and then all the dependents can stay and wait in their home country, saving costs at least for the initial flight for the family. So we first tried this in October of 2024 with a Filipino spouse of a US applicant, and they trusted us to try it as an alternative. And surprisingly, because of a few email exchanges with the UE before we submitted the application, it looks like it was possible. So we submitted it, they were approved, and then we did successive applications like this. For example, for some parents in February 2025, in April 2025, it was for an unmarried partner, for children. So it's definitely a possibility. So if, for example, they didn't fly together with the main applicant in Spain, if you have a passport allowing visa-free entry, then you can just simply fly to Spain. That's not an issue. If they need a visa, you can get a standard Schengen tourist visa. You can also get a one-year DNV from the consulate using the approval letter as proof for the DNV. And then you enter Spain, and then you go straight to your TIA appointment. Okay. And then now, so all of you are here in Spain, like as a family, reunited and together. Can you work for companies in Spain? So the answer depends on what kind of category you are in. So if you're an employee, it's an absolute ban. You can't work for a Spanish company. If you're a freelancer, yes, you can work for a Spanish company up to 20% only, and it must be on a remote freelance basis. So it can't be in person and it can't be as an employee. So if, for example, you wanted to start your waitressing era or your bartending era, unfortunately, this isn't yet the time, maybe after citizenship. Now, what about family members accompanying you? So yes, all family members who are of adult age can work up to 100% for Spanish companies as employees. They can also become self-employed, so they can be autonomous. They can also open up their own business. So basically, they can do everything that they can with regard to work. Since when you receive the resident card, it will actually show there that they are authorized to work. Now, another confusion that I get here a lot, and that a lot of Spanish companies aren't as familiar with, is we have had cases where applicants are approved and they have a job offer already. So what some Spanish companies think is that unless you have the TIE, then you can't start work yet. However, it's not true. So the right to work is ex lege, it's by law, and it's not ex plastic, it's not by TIE. So as soon as you're approved, you already have a right to work with the Spanish company. And this is something that we've also, although it's something that we know, it's also something we've explicitly confirmed with UHE. And this has happened 2 times. And eventually, like once we communicate with the Spanish company through our applicants, they were able to work even before they got their TM. Okay, now we're in the last part for Social Security and taxes. So the cost of working in Spain. First, let's talk Social Security. If you're a contractor, or for those who will apply as autonomous, for year one, it's a flat rate of around 80 euros per month. And some regions like Andalusia, Madrid, and Murcia offer 100% subsidies. For year two onwards, please note, this is where a lot of people get surprised. There is a significant increase, and the amount is calculated based on your income. For employees, you have two options, again, depending on which option you chose as applying as an employee. So, option one is you pay nothing in Spain if you have a certificate coverage from your treaty country and you just continue paying, or your employer continues paying in the home country. Option two is if your employer has actually registered here in Spain for Social Security to pay you, then your employer will have to actually pay on your behalf for the Social Security system. Now, what about tax? Your tax obligations will also depend on how you're here as. So, if you are normally taxed on a graduated scale from 19 to 47%, and please note that this percentage, it's not a flat rate applied to the entire amount. So, only the income falling into the higher brackets is taxed at a higher rate. So you can use this calculator. It's autonomoinfo.com, and you can simulate how much it is that you have to pay in taxes and in Social Security on the first year, on the second year, depending on which province that you will reside in. just so that you have an idea how much you will be paying. Now, I also get asked like if there's a significant difference between regions with regards to tax, and this is something that I did through the calculator to see. But the difference between the highest and the lowest is just 1 to 2%. So it's really the biggest cost differentiator is not going to be taxes; it's really going to be rent, because across Spain, costs for transport, groceries, utilities is generally the same. It's really rent that will cost the biggest difference. Now, if you're an employee, you can then also opt into Becklam's law, which will offer you a flat 24% tax rate on Spanish sourced income. Okay, so depending, is the Beckham's law always the best choice? It not always. So a lot of autonomous applicants get jealous to say, no, oh, I wish I could have had a flat 24% tax rate. It really depends. Best to contact a tax attorney to run the figures. But sometimes as autonomous, you can actually get away with lower tax rates, which we will show in the next screen. Okay, so here we've actually broken down, or I've actually broken it down to easily show you how much you would be paying in taxes and social security. So, for example, for the first year, if you have one applicant, so that's 2,763 euros monthly, in tax, you will be paying around 492 euros or around 18%. And in SS, that's around 80 euros, and their net take home will be 2,191 euros, and effectively your SSS plus tax is 20.69%. If you're a family of four, for example, the monthly income requirement is 4,490, and then your tax will be 1,073, which is around the 24.34%. And effectively, your net take home is 3,337, or around 25% for SSS and tax. So here you also see the amounts for the rest of the figures, depending on how much or how many people you are bringing over. So you can see it's around a 20 to 26% rate for the first year. Okay. What about for the second year onward? So this is where a lot of people get the sticker shock, especially from the flat rate to the graduated rate. So you will see on the second year with the same income, the tax actually goes down by a little bit. So you will see that it's now down to 16.9% for tax, but for Social Security, it increases to 426 from 80. So the net take home is 1942, and then here's a percentage of 30%. So from one applicant to six applicants, it's 30 to 33%, depending on which bracket you fall on. And please note that this province is actually based on results from Madrid, just because it's where a lot of applicants also move to.